Welcome to another episode of Tradecraft Tuesday. This is September 2020. I know 2020 is a crazy year, but here we are. So I know last month, I checked the show notes. Last month we actually said that this month we were going to finish up the MITRE attack framework. Okay, I'm going to be totally transparent. We forgot. We forgot that that's what the topic was. We came up with a totally different topic. Today's topic is downloaders, droppers, and stagers. So we're going to be talking about some of that kind of stuff. We'll get into what they are, how attackers use them, why they do that, and that'll be cool. So before we kick it off, a little administrivia. If you're using the chat, which we highly recommend, that way you can interact with us, you can interact with other folks here. Make sure that little drop down there says all panelists and attendees. That way everybody sees it, not just us. So sometimes people only send it to us and then we respond to them, and then people are super confused. And then if you have questions you want us to answer, use the question and answer feature down at the bottom of your Zoom down here, the Q&A, put your questions in there. That way we make sure that we answer them. So without further ado, let's jump into some news.
No doubt. So I was taking a look, Chris. Obviously, there's all kinds of things that went on, but I think maybe maybe my favorite of all the spy novel, cool cybersecurity tradecraft was probably the shindig that went on with what was it, a targeted attack against the Tesla factory?
Yeah.
So I gotta imagine many have already seen this since there's nothing new about this news if you're on the bleeding edge. But in case you've lived under a rock, right at the end of August, I think it was like the last week, more and more news was coming out from an FBI report, as well as Tesla themselves confirming that, obviously everybody wants to get a little piece of Tesla, whether it's the stock, the car, you name it. And this was a case of organized crime. So how the essentially criminal complaint, spun off, it clearly painted a picture that, look, someone, from a crime syndicate, obviously they actually accuse a gentleman named Igor, right? You couldn't get it any better than this, right? When writing your spy novel or your cyber crime novel. But
if it were in a book, we'd all say, "Oh, come on, that's just too easy."
Yeah. Already in chat, folks are saying, "Hey, this is 2 steps away from a Mark Vasinovich book," which is so true. Yep. So Igor comes on over. He finds I believe it was Ukrainian or Russian, native employee, and the long story short is made the proposition of, hey, if you install ransomware through the network, we'll cut you in. And effectively what's alleged is it's up to $1 million. Wasn't that the cut in for the attack?
Yeah, they were going to pay him $1 million to introduce some malware into the network.
Yeah, so that's that's super cool. If you haven't seen, we threw the link in there, but that is just straight out of it gives a great example of what the risk worth the reward. Thankfully, the employee warned Tesla. Tesla used their internal security plus law enforcement cooperation. And, from what we can tell, it doesn't look like there was an incident. So with that said, companies like Tesla probably get higher offerings. I highly doubt the local small business is going to get, I doubt your employees are going to get offered $1 million to go against you. But this might be the moment you take a step back and say, all right, what am I protecting if somebody was offered similar? Yep. Where does the juice worth the squeeze? A couple $1,000, it might be enough for somebody to pay off their rent. Especially
you might not even need a couple thousand. I mean, remember what's his name?
Wozniak. Yeah,
Wozniak. It was a few $100, $600, right?
And this is that MSP employee that compromised or, after getting fired, started selling his access into the MSP there in, was it Georgia?
Georgia, yep, in Atlanta.
Yeah, that's exactly right outside of Atlanta. So anyways, that's cool news. Definitely, I saw it as the highlight of all the different news that was going on. But there was other cool stories. Like, I think I saw Bleeping Computer had an article that was in regards to the Windows 10 themes. Anybody want to cover that one?
Yep. So this one it's not a new attack. It's been around for a long time. And it's basically, if you're on a domain and you try to access, some remote UNC URL and that URL says like, hey, you need authorization for this, your computer will send your password hash over SMB to try and associate with the machine, which is why everybody always says, block any outbound SMB traffic at the router, at the firewall, all that kind of stuff. This one I thought was a little bit interesting because instead of trying to get somebody to click some crazy looking URL or something like that, they packaged up a Windows 10 theme so you can like theme stuff with backgrounds and different colors and all that kind of stuff.
Dark mode, you name it.
Yeah, and just by installing this theme, it would try to like fetch resources from something and then could steal your password hash and crack it. So
yeah, and this was from our friend Bohops, old Jimmy Bain, representing the Maryland area. So kudos on that cool research. Once again, this is just some of that stuff. If you think about, like when we talk about layered security or preventing outbound SMB requests, for instance, part of your layered security here is if you are allowing remote SMB shares to require authentication, or excuse me, not require authentication, but allow authentication to go out your, and traverse your network. This is some of the stuff that you risk. So super wild.
Yep. So I put one in here about a phishing attack. Nothing really new about phishing attacks other than this one was kind of interesting because instead of trying to recreate the page, we showed some attacks previously. I think you did one on a webinar with ID Agent, right? Where they showed like a mocked up fake like Facebook page and stuff like that. Instead of trying to mock up a page and make it look the same, they actually loaded the real page in the background and had a partial screen overlay on the top. And in the overlay, that's where it says like, oh, you need your password to access some stuff. So if anybody ever got, questioned and they were like, this seems fishy, and they went and clicked any of the links, well, it's the real website loaded in the background with an overlay on top. And so all the links are legit. Everything there is the real site. And so like people were more trusting of this, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, if I recall at one time, and probably even still at this point, the ability for somebody to embed your website over top of another website is some of the stuff that the web developer can do a little bit to stop allowing that. It's one of our like 12,000 things that we've taken a look at. And I'm not even sure if we ever fixed it, Chris, but at the end of the day, this is one of those allowing somebody to embed your website over top of another website opens these like obscure attack surface where it's not so much your vulnerability per se, but it's enabling another attack to happen. It's just one of these, never-ending amount of shady things going on. Worth mentioning if you've never heard of that or seen that before. But Chris, there was one more that, and I actually set it up, by the way. So we've got even an up-to-date example of some of this. But, we talked about the Dharma ransomware and the source code becoming public. And this is something that I know we've talked about for years. Obviously ransomware is one of those never-ending dull moments, but it's always bothersome when you see like, it was what, Dharma and Crisis ransomware, if I recall, Chris, their source code was disclosed. And so now we see like script kiddies making easy variants of the ransomware.
Yep. Yeah, it's, I'm not entirely sure if the like Dharma attackers meant for their source code to get out. Like if they were just like, we're kind of done here, we'll post this publicly or what, but it seems some Iranian, the article quote says they are newbie hackers, have picked up the source code and are now using it again. And so like more people are using it. And so Dharma is back. And in this case, the article actually said a lot of what the researchers were seeing was it was spreading through OpenRDP ports.
Yeah, this is another example of that human-operated ransomware, where people get in and then they kick off the ransomware.
John, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you see something like literally this morning, which was Dharma? Do you any idea what the heck the backstory was on?
We don't have the backstory yet, but we did see it this morning. Customer was hit with Crisis Dharma this morning. I'm not sure how they got in yet.
Oh man, that'd be sweet. If any of the ThreatOps team is watching, that'd be sweet to get a live update on the sucker. But with that said, we're not here for ransomware. We're not here for news. We're here to learn. And so, Chris, obviously we spent the long US weekend relaxing, and then this morning came around and we said, hey, what's all the tradecraft that we want to cover? And what's funny is if anybody's familiar with like Lockheed's cyber kill chain, or you got the MITRE attack, they all go into all the different stages of like an attack. For instance, how do you get in? How do you stay in? How do you exfiltrate out? But because they're large organizational frameworks, you don't always get the nitty gritty, or you don't always get like a great example of like, what are hackers actually being challenged on? So I'll screen share just here for a second, and it should be long enough. Just if you give me a second here, I've got a lovely, the 12,000 things on my page. This is Lockheed Martin's cyber kill chain. So you see it goes from reconnaissance to weaponizing the exploit, actually delivering it, whether it's over email or however you get it into the network. And then it goes on, exploitation, installation, command and control, accomplishing your goals. And that is your cyber kill chain. One of the things that always kills me about you guys is like delivery. We just kind of like, a bit of whitewash. Like delivery has a lot of things that go into it. It could be cool phishing. It could be, how maybe you RDP'd into the network and you use the SMB shares, or you used like remote desktops clipboard to be able to get it in there. But guys, you and I have all ran into this case. So we're in the network. Now, how do we stay in the network? And when we stay inside the network, more or less, how do we get more nastiness in the network before we get it out? So do we want to maybe sugarcoat and like explain a little bit what went through our heads on that offensive piece when it came to why would we use a downloader? What's the difference between a downloader or a dropper, and then stagers as well? Let's start painting that story for the audience before we start getting into the technical.
Yeah. So downloaders and droppers usually are just like really small bits of code. A lot of times we see them as like PowerShell snippets, or it might be some code in like an HTA file or something like that. And really its job is to like download whatever the new malware is and run that. And so like rather than the attacker having their malware download and install, they just install this kind of like little thing that phones home. So it's a downloader. Its job is to go download something and run it.
I think about this like right with target validation. For instance, if you're really elite, right, you're the top of the echelon in security, well, you might have some really cool tools that you don't want to burn. So it makes sense, for instance, when you get into a network, whether it was with that email, whether it's through a payload, maybe you don't want to take a risk of your stuff immediately getting caught up by that antivirus product. Or if you're throwing some exploit over the wire, well, maybe you got somebody that's doing full packet capture, or they're decrypting SSL on you. So there's all kinds of things that you might want to keep in mind. And from an equities perspective, I, no offense, don't want you seeing my awesome stage 2 really sexy tools. I'm going to use something mundane to do target validation. So, and I think we've seen this kind of morph into crimeware as well, where they're more willing to have like their downloaders burnt before giving out kind of like the end payload, which might be more data collection, maybe very specific data collection. And no offense, like if you're an actor that's targeting multiple environments, like when I think of the JRAT, the Java rat exploiters, they don't necessarily know what they're going against. So they might actually drop something in like Java as the stage 0, and then maybe like Java, since it can run on just about anything, maybe that allows them to make the decision, oh, I'm going to drop a 64-bit payload that's going to be tailored towards, Windows 10, or I'm going to drop something that's Linux specific, like an ELF. So there's a lot of real good reasons why you do that. Chris, in your case, you're an exploit developer by trade, but even before you get to that fancy like malware that actually does the collection, did you not have some of that similar conclusion of like, when your exploit was running? Would you use staging at all? Would you want to explain a little bit of that?
Yeah, a lot of times, and it gets into the technical, like how do exploits work, but a lot of times there's only so much data that you can send. So you only have so much room for some code that you send over that's going to execute as part of your exploit. And so you got to figure out, okay, do I try to fit everything I want in this bit of code, the space I have, or do I just make this a very simple like stage payload that runs and goes and gets a much bigger and then extracts that and runs that? And so usually the thing you do is you'll have a very simple stager whose job is just to go out and fetch the next stage and execute that in memory. And that way you can make your exploit as small as possible, as fast as possible. And even if it gets burned, it's not burning your real legit malware that's going to do something. And the reason for kind of this and what we see with downloaders and droppers of not taking the full malware and writing it to disk or storing it on the machine is that takes a lot of time, energy, money to develop these like full built out, pieces of malware. A lot of times they have, crazy specific stuff in there for harvesting, emails. Some of the new stuff with Emotet, they actually harvest your emails from your Outlook file to capture like text from the subject line and all that kind of stuff. All those take a long time to build. They don't want those to immediately get like signatured and burned. So they try to give you just the smallest little piece they can that stays on your machine so that if you detect it, well, there's really nothing that's going to burn their malware everywhere else they're using it.
Yeah, Chris, so I just posed the question in chat, and obviously for any of our users that are watching this, at the end of the day, if you think of those macro-enabled Word docs, like, or, Excel spreadsheets, you get it, they give you some page, they say, please enable editing, they then say, enable macros or whatever the funky social engineering they use. I posed the question of, do you want to guess whether or not, they include the full payload or they include a downloader stager? And this is something that's a bit of, it's a bit of an art rather than a science. So for instance, the question I asked, it's a bit of a loaded one, because to be honest, if I am an actor that knows enough about my target set, say for instance, I know you're using a really busted email chain and you allow me to send big emails, and I'm not necessarily so worried about what your email filter might be doing, or maybe I know you use no email filter, I might send you the whole darn payload in the email, right? The whole entire, instead of a Word doc being like a couple 100 kilobytes, maybe I'll send you a full 5 meg email. And the reason for that is, well, if I get you to open my email, the whole thing is running, especially if I've done maybe some analysis and I've looked and maybe you've got some sort of like packet filtering or proxy or something of that nature. That's a bit of my risk decision making of, oh, you know what? I'm going to get past email, very low worry. On top of it, when my email gets run, I'm going to have to take the guess of, is your behavior-based security on the endpoint? Is that game strong? If it's weak, well, that's a perfect example to send you the full unstaged, full installer for the malware. But that's not always the case. John, you see a lot of staged malware. You want to cover the pieces of, John, like where you as an actor would think about like, you know what? I don't actually want to use the full payload. I might actually want to stage, and maybe relate it to an example of some of the malware that we see on a daily.
Trying to think of one. I had it.
Emotet's the one I always think of. They rarely in their payloads, it's always,
yeah. They've got the email that comes in. You click the email, download, open up the Word doc, and then get the initial payload. And then once they're inside, they can start adding other modules. What does somebody have? Oh, even Chris is the one who said that.
Yeah, so when I think about that, right, does anybody recall, is it WordPress? Is that where usually the Emotet actors, they're compromising those websites to store their stage payload?
I mean, I don't think they discriminate. I think they'll host them anywhere.
Yeah.
But WordPress is so full of vulnerabilities, and it takes so much effort to update it that so many people just, they're like, oh, I need a site. They pay some company. The company builds it on top of WordPress. They put it on the internet. Done, and they never revisit it, so it never gets updated.
Yeah, Mike in chat said, hey, I'm okay with sending a staged payload, right? I'll let the full version of it download in the background. And for those that have never seen it, like there's some of the open source tool like frameworks like Metasploit, and ironically, this article that I'll share real quick and do just a tad bit of screen sharing. Its whole premise behind this article is, how can you hack without Metasploit per se, which is a little bit of a funny title. But what's really neat about this article is they dive into it, and they even have a whole section on here, staged versus unstaged payloads. And you'll notice the conversations here first, they're just educating. Like you might notice here an interpreter, if you've ever used it, anybody who's used the red teaming framework or penetration testing framework, one of them says shell/reverse TCP, one of them is underscores. And that key difference here is one's staged, one's unstaged. Right? Does it send all together, or does it start with a reverse TCP stager and then pulls the shell separately? So that's kind of the same logic. And if you take a look, these are built into frameworks to allow like more, I won't say sophisticated, but more operation security aware. And that you can even say like, look, you're using a staged payload, you need to use a handler that can handle this type of payload. So there's different types of scenarios. It's kind of like if, if you think about in a game of, catch, if I'm throwing Chris a baseball, right? He's got to be prepared that I'm going to throw him a fastball if he thinks everything's being lobbed to him. Or for instance, if he's prepared to catch a tiny little baseball and I throw him a bigger softball, that's the type of stuff that actually runs, into the hacker's mindset of considering what's, why do I use it and when do I use it? And notice Chris's example, he said, hey, think about buffer overflows. You might sometimes only have so much amount of work, right? You can only overflow the buffer so much till it corrupts the program from running. So sometimes you got to be able to have these, in both sides of your arsenal, just in case you need to know. So,
yep. Andy made a good point in chat. Something that we try to advise people on often is that, and he said, with a downloader, they can switch the payload in real time anytime they want. And we've seen this a number of times before where we'll find something like some adware or something. Sometimes we find, can't think of the malware that is like, oh, this is mostly just an adware or whatever. It's fine. It's not that big of a deal. Well, today it might be adware, but what if it's ransomware tomorrow? Is that really what you want? Like you probably want to get rid of this thing and have like good network hygiene and stuff rather than just hoping that like, oh, it was adware today. It'll just stay adware forever. And this is actually kind of played out in real life on a number of cases like places like the Chrome App Store and stuff, where somebody had made some extension to Chrome. It was approved. It had a bunch of installs. A bunch of people were, giving it thumbs up saying, yeah, this is good. This does good stuff. And then somebody comes along and says, hey, I really want to do something with this. What if I pay you $1,000? Can I buy this Chrome extension off you? They buy it off of them. They use it to deploy malware. So now you have this thing that built up reputation that was legitimate for a while. Tomorrow, malware.
Yeah. My good friend Nick Roby here just threw in a chat, said, hey, think about this from the forensics perspective as well. So not only would that be awesome to pay somebody for legitimacy to give you this payload, right, that helps maybe stage a more persistent access, think about this from anti-forensics. And so if anybody's never heard of anti-forensics, the whole concept is, well, you're probably going to get caught. How can you minimize when you get caught how bad the damage is? So for instance, if you have this bare bones minimal stager that's only, collecting whatever that new payload could be, keep in mind, as somebody mentioned, I think it was Andy mentioned in there, like, hey, you could rip and replace this all day. One of the most beautiful parts is if you only catch the stager, which sometimes at Huntress, that's all we catch. And you might collect that stager, but you have no clue what's on the other end of that payload. And so if you're looking maybe with the typical timeline being anywhere from a couple months, after an incident to larger, well, congrats, you have some bare bones forensics. You know how they got in, you know how they were staging it, you know what domain they were using. But now that the actual, keys to the castle or their true payload, what was really sexy was, stored somewhere encrypted on a server, and now that server's torn down. Like, what are you going to analyze from a forensics perspective? How are you going to build those indicators of compromise to warn other people if you can't actually find it? So it's just a wild, trade-off between kind of cat and mouse of, look, you want to get your payload in there as good as possible or as safe as possible, but you also want to protect yourself. At the same time, I personally wrote detectors to find stagers, like Metasploit stager that it uses to reach out for like HTTP or HTTPS, uses a user agent string, which I believe by default, and you can change it, says like Meterpreter payload in the darn thing. So these are some of those things that you have to remember, that if you do choose to stage, well, the hacker's taking some risks, that there's actual people looking at those forensics, looking at the network traffic saying, this might be better, this might be worse. With that said, John, you see more stagers and downloaders than Chris and I combined. You live in this. Do you want to share a little bit about like maybe some of the different download cradles? I've got some articles that I could share with the team, but whether we want to screen share or bring up some URLs, up to you.
We can screen share that, I guess. Let me see.
I got that Matt Green article, which is the forensics gentleman out of Australia. If you want me to maybe screen share that one, we can start with it.
All right, start with that. I accidentally closed the wrong window. Hold on.
No worries, John. So Matt in his article says PowerShell download cradles. Cradle, right? It's a word we haven't used in here. You could also technically kind of use the word loader instead of stager. There's a bit of semantics there,
They
but
call it a cradle because it's like the baby version.
you know,
And why do they call it a cradle? I never got that.
I mean, I'm gonna nurse you into the environment. I don't know. I don't know where I'm going there, but you know, long story short, it's exactly what we saw from here. And you notice that Matt's article here says, look, there's a lot of different PowerShell cradles. And I'm going to open some of these, John, in full screen so you could dig in a little bit better.
Oh, let me switch. Oh yeah, there you go. I was looking at it there. Yeah, we see a lot of the top one. The download string is very, very, very common. And I've seen all sorts of variations of it. They'll switch up the case. So if you're doing string matching and you don't normalize it, they say, for example, the D will be lowercase and the rest of the word of download will be uppercase. And so if you don't normalize the string, if you're just doing string matching, you're going to totally miss it. So that's one we see all the time.
Yeah, instantiating that net web client.
Yeah.
And notice here, almost all these first ones have that in common. So if we're just thinking about, like John mentioned, download string. Well, if you're only looking for those strings, and not that, you know, there's nothing wrong. There's no fancy machine learning to any of this. At the end of the day, you could write some pretty sexy regular expressions to be able to find some of this stuff very effective. But notice just between the top example and the bottom example, if you're only looking for download string, well, there's a lot of ways to skin this cat, right? Download string becomes download data. Both of them instantiating the new object for, you know, net.web client. So you got to keep this in mind, right? At the same time, old invoke expression, which we've talked about a dozen times on this thing.
That one's just, I'm not actually familiar with download data, but based on the get string, I'm thinking it's just reading the file and then it's piping that to invoke expression, IEX.
Yep.
Yeah, so a whole bunch, right? We keep going even further. You see .web client has open read here as well. This is the difference between get string, download data, and IO stream reader. Still along the lines, a whole bunch here. So as you're thinking about, you know, from indicators of compromise, good old fashioned clear text. If you're using something like Sysmon, or for anybody that has like an EDR solution that's truly gathering all the different executed commands, or they're using like command line filtering, even if you turn on the built-in Windows 10 option for analyzing PowerShell commands. These are all great examples of low-hanging fruit that you could find some of these download cradles or stagers. With that said, John, we looked through tons of these, and we know that there's, for every like nasty one, there's 1,000 legitimate, somebody using to map network shares, somebody using something to be able to, you know, manage their like the LabTech PowerShell framework, or LT
what is it called? And a lot of Azure blobs, people will store their scripts on Azure and run maintenance utilities from there is the other common one.
So John, we got all these examples here that we see, right, of downloading PowerShell files. Do you want to share a little bit? I mean, notice here, for instance, this is just using the built-in COM features. But again, another ability, instead of just using the built-in, hey, how can I use some of these other objects? You wouldn't believe the amount of things, like if you have Word or Excel, for instance, you'll notice both these COM objects are leveraged to be able to open a remote file, read the contents. And John, this is one that you've seen firsthand, if I recall, right? We saw an example of, you want to maybe share that, that banking example where someone left a sheet open.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. The Excel one was very similar to this. Let me pull up actually it's in the share if you want to bring it up. I can talk about it if you've got still screen share, or I can switch.
Up to you, John, if you want to. I do like some of the comments while you're bringing that up, you know. You have the cradle because the payload is your baby, John. That's probably the best example of why I call it cradle.
Yep. Go ahead and keep chatting while I pull it up.
It's the tap dance nature. What's funny about this is there's non-stop of the shadiness you find out here. So John, it looks like you're bringing up maybe a handful of different.
Hold on it.
You got something too shady on your screen, couldn't share?
My box is crawling now. I can't open any other tabs. Hold
So
on.
that was my my cradle there doing its job. I've actually got some examples here, John, if you don't mind, while we pull that up.
I'll send you the link if I can. How about that?
Okay, that works for me. So one of the examples I found, I was just trying to see, in Huntress of some of the nonsense, because it's nice to be able to see like, here's what a red team is doing, and yeah, if you have surgical. But for instance, some of these crimeware examples are great, right? If you take a look, this is something that in the last week that we pulled up, right? And if you take a peek under here, this is almost identical to what we saw before, right? We see, what is this, a WMI event consumer. So it's got a little bit of persistence. It's going to run a command line, when the computer either boots up or when an event happens. And we take a look here, right at the bottom, we see command.exe, calling PowerShell, so a little bit of indirection. There's that invoke expression. We see new object web client, download string, and I don't know what's on safety mango.fun. Be careful if anybody's visiting. I don't know if this thing's live or not.
It could be super fun though.
What's that?
It could be super fun. You never know.
I mean, it ends in .fun, right? So with the top level domain ending .fun, I'm sure that it's good. John, do you have any idea? I saw a lot of these that your team reported, whether, just download string, right? Some of them look like crypto coin miners. And if you see, even on our end, we just warn you, like, look, it's a downloader, it's nasty, it's on your box. And obviously this is where you have that multiple layers. Not only are you looking what's, executing, obviously you got your AV working its butt off to stop the behavior, but every now and then something slips past. So theoretically, if you had something like domain reputation or DNS filtering, hopefully safety mango.fun is not allowed, right?
I tried it. I got no DNS resolution.
Okay, so hopefully it's down. And sometimes that's a great example for, the team that mentioned, like Nick that mentioned, like, in our side, if we went and downloaded this, maybe the payload isn't even available. So we don't know if this was something maybe as benign as like a crypto coin miner, or maybe as shady as something that's like, a loader for some other botnet or, keystroke logger or something of that nature.
Yep.
So John, do you got your malware under control, or is your box still dying there?
I think it worked this time. All right, can you see that?
Yeah, I don't see any file extensions ending in like dharma or dot crisis here, so I think you're okay.
So this is one we saw last summer. We've only seen it I think once, but it was really interesting. In this case, it was a WMI event consumer. And if you look, so it was an encoded command, and down below there is the decoded command, and the section in red is the interesting part. So there's that download string toward the right with the uppercase and lowercase randomization. But notice it's retrieving a file from docs.google.com, specifically a spreadsheet. And it's referencing a cell inside that B1, and there's a regex, and it does a bunch of processing on it. But if you open up, here's the spreadsheet, and there's that B1 cell, somebody's Google Doc, not restricted access. They got into it. I believe it had something to do with a bank somewhere in South America, if I recall correctly. But in this case, they put their payload in there, and it's just a bunch of ASCII characters that get joined together and runs I don't remember exactly what this command did, honestly. But
it's malware all the way down, John.
Yep.
I've seen this technique used before, actually, for command and control, where like the Google sheet would be used to actually store the commands that people wanted to run. And so like the endpoint would basically be fetching, oh, the cell's empty, okay, nothing, the cell's empty. And then at some point the attacker would put something in the cell, bam, it picks it up and runs it. And the hard part is even for anybody doing like DNS filtering or any of that kind of stuff, you're gonna block Google Docs. Maybe that works if you only have O365, but if somebody ever needs to share a Google Doc with another team, then what?
Yeah, I mean, albeit creative, Kat was quick to mention, what a terrible
Yeah.
waste of intelligence and creativity. Um, I
I'm
mean,
actually,
yeah,
oh, good.
I was gonna say definitely elegant. I remember Twitter though too. Like I've seen bots, right? IRC bots use similar ideas. The Twitter bots where people would just fetch a hard-coded username for whatever the tweet was. And if you think about this, what's crazy is this might not even be their spreadsheet. This might be some other, John, you mentioned bank or something like that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure this was, we've graded out, but the stuff that was down below had some, I believe there were some names of like cities or something in South America, and that's kind of how we figured out it was a bank in South America.
So think about the nonsense. Since this is somebody's legitimate, I mean, how do you even do a fraud report on this, right? Like, do you go to Google and say, hey, I got some malware being stored in this document? And then they go through and what are they going to take down some bank's legitimate spreadsheet that they're using? Like, it just adds, maybe they do, but it just adds layers of complexity in regards to like how quick, like you get some resilience by coming up with these really novel ways to download or, drop extra payloads. And you get the benefit that unless some sort of advanced auditing is on this sucker, you're not going to know that they're updating this cell a half dozen times, right? You're not going to get any of that history that this cell is, or these sheets are constantly updating. So as a result, like just short of Google that maybe they're storing all the different versions of this document file or spreadsheet, no one's going to know, right? That's it's wild, right? It's a really novel use of, I guess, agility plus the benefit of, if there's simple stager pulling these back and forth, right? It's, I don't know, it's just an ideal mechanism. Hats off to the hacker that did it, albeit I would love to see them work on the, the white hat side. But guys, like we know that there's a lot more, like you got to have something that's downloading. We shared PowerShell, for instance, and it was ideal, but we know there's a heck of a lot more scrutiny. There's stuff you can do like constrained language mode to start limiting what some PowerShell can do. We've even seen some PowerShell, as kind of mentioned in the chat, that's using like, DNS over HTTPS to evade some of these. But there's a heck of a lot more things that can be downloading these payloads than just PowerShell. Does anybody maybe want to set the stage with these? Because I've got some cool examples that I want to share. But Chris, I know you've had some hands-on examples of using real things, like whether it's maybe if you're on Linux, you can use SSH, right? You can pull files, other files, right? That's what it's meant for, or wget. But set the tone. What are hackers doing nowadays?
So there's a whole site for this. We've mentioned it before, LOL bins. And one of the things that they capture on there is how to use some legitimate application to do something else, something not totally intended to do. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we've seen where basically people have figured out like, oh, if I use this executable and this parameter, it actually downloads a file. So you'll see things like reg svr32. Kyle and I talked about this at
maybe Derby or
DerbyCon. Yeah, like how many years ago was that? 2017 or something?
So, yeah.
We talked about how Squibbly-Doo uses reg svr32 to download a DLL and execute it. We've seen a bunch of cases of this. Most recently, I think it was like last week, somebody said, hey, look, there's a parameter for the Windows Defender agent that will download a file. Seems weird, but hey, I mean, it makes sense. Like the attackers, that's what they're looking for. And the reason they're looking for that is they want to avoid detection. So somebody who's using like a SIM or a basic EDR or like next-gen AV, it's going to look at that and say, oh, this is a trusted executable. That's fine. It's good to go. But how can I abuse that trust in a way that I get what I want?
So Chris, going a little old school before we get to some of the brand new hotness, right? This is probably one of my favorites, especially because I know a lot of our audience uses like M365. So, for instance, you see a researcher out here said, hey, I was researching Microsoft Teams, it's just something that some people do. And one of the things that was really exciting, they said, hey, I realized Teams is built off of, kind of some of the Squirrel or NuGet package updater, right? Which is a package management capability. It's great for updating. And one of the things that, to their surprise, they noticed there was a lovely argument called update. And it turns out that they weren't the only one. A handful of other security researchers discovered this. And what they ended up learning was the Microsoft Teams binary, update.exe, which is signed by Microsoft, or the squirrel.exe binary. Either one of these, you could prepare a package in a certain way, and I won't bore you with it, but the idea behind it is you grab any legit new package. You know, he talks about it, he calls his exploit here. He adds some shell code, right, as squirrel.exe, compresses the folder. He recalculates the sum so it passes the checksum feature. He creates a releases file and voila, and I won't bore you with the video here, but you could imagine he would run update.exe, specify where's the web server where this could be coming from, and it would actually download. And if you follow these very simple, you can't hardly see with this screenshot here, but it would download from the URL and it would upload and execute the payload. And so if you think about what this gives from a behavior perspective, any process, like if you're using sysmon, where you're looking at like what's the parent process and it's spawning child processes, and what is that user agent string? Well, you expect teams to reach out to a website. You expect teams to spawn a sub process. That's how the updater works. So that wouldn't be so weird. It's only when you get into the minutia do you start asking, like, I expect teams to reach out, but maybe to Microsoft.com, not, shady.ru, or, for instance, I expect it to run this package, but I don't expect it to run an unsigned installer. For instance, they talked about changing squirrel.exe to some shellcode. So that's where you really have to start getting down into the weeds. And this is something that's been exploited over and over. That same, teams.exe that was vulnerable, Microsoft almost immediately, realized that, okay, this is a bad thing. We don't want it to allow, teams should only be able to reach out to certain websites. And for those of you that hadn't followed the most recent update, one of the wild things were I think almost a year later, so when did we see that? That was in 2019 that happened. If I screen share just real quick, we can see, hey, look, in addition to this, he mentions, hey, TrustWave came across. And if we followed the TrustWave article all the way in August, the same researcher came back and said, you know what? I realized that instead of pulling this off of, the website, which Microsoft patched it so it couldn't go to anything that was HTTP or HTTPS or maybe some WebDAV shares, they actually said, well, you know what? I'm going to actually just allow this to go over an SMB share, which if you think,
That's clever.
if you think about this, this is one of those like,
Tricky.
okay, well, fine. If you allow SMB out, which was, to be honest, this is how we started the show in the news, talking about the downfall of allowing SMB to go out of your network. All the way in August, Microsoft came forth and was like, oh crap, we got a bug. Obviously, Regan found, a bug in this again and used it the same exact way. You see the warning here. It warns them only local paths are allowed. He says, okay, I'll take your local path and I'll one-up you, and then gives it a remote SMB share or Samba share, and once again gets the payload to execute trusted. So this is kind of the modern era of abusing legit, applications that have legit behavior for malicious perspective.
Yep. Yeah, and that's it's tough, right? Like if you're some of these like next gen AV and places like Sophos, SentinelOne, and all that kind of stuff, you at some point you have to make a distinction of like, okay, this is legitimate software. It's going to do things, but it's legitimate, so it's fine. But you can really just be undermined, unfortunately, by the software vendors where they basically lend out their legitimacy to anyone. Like, oh, you want to do stuff as us? Cool. Just use this parameter.
Yeah, which, we got 15 minutes into this. Do we want to maybe share a little bit? I know that was kind of mentioned about the Microsoft situation. I think that's a really high note to start preparing the end of our conversation before we talk about some defense. John, I know we had all looked at this weekend. Ironically, Microsoft has already responded very quick to some of this status, but I think it's neat to see how some of these things escalate. So I don't mind screen sharing, but does somebody mind, maybe giving a little bit of the verbal track that goes with this?
Of which part?
This is the Microsoft downloader. So we talk about, downloading all
your teams.
nasty things. I brought up the tweet that was heard around the world on September 2nd. We now see has been retweeted over 1,000 times by nerds all over the place. But this is the built-in, Microsoft malware protection command line in Windows Defender. So anybody want to walk through real quick of what's going down or what this researcher is suggesting?
Yeah, so again, I think this is another one of those cases where I don't know what the actual use case is behind this, but Microsoft decided that like, hey, we need some way from a command line to be able to easily download a file. And so they added it to the np command run.exe. You pass a download file, give it a URL, and yeah, it will just download the file and place it for you. And you even get to tell it where to place it. It's not even like a specific file or an update that has to be in one given place. You can place it anywhere you want.
So notice the communication on this thing. Almost right away, people say like, oh, this is a lol bin, or lol bass, by the way, is like binaries and scripts. But they said, already given a medal for binary or lol bin of the year. And you see, people rallying behind this, from other defense researchers all the way down to people, with the shock face, right? It's more than a download utility. People being sarcastic of like, hey, I only use it for malware. But it keeps going. And what's one of the things that almost everybody asked about this was, does this lend some credibility? Does this allow Windows, Defender to be bypassed? And so, for instance, Dave Kennedy, a great researcher, with he's at Binary Defense and the Trusted Sec team.
Trusted Sec, yeah.
So he's showing here built in on this Windows 10 box. He's saying, look, I try to use the squibbly do mechanism, which is the mechanism that, as Chris mentioned, using Redshift 32 to be able to download. Another example of a downloader. And you see Windows Defender finding this right away. Found, threats found. It failed to pull it off this 172.16 IP, whatever was in there, probably a calc payload. And his very next screenshot here on September 2nd is you see, hey, look, using this capability with, the MP command run, downloading that same exact payload, and then with the actual Redshift 32, now executing a local script. So instead of downloading the scriptlet from the internet, he uses the built-in Microsoft capability in Defender to be able to execute it locally. And we see he gets a calc payload here. So at least on September 2nd, that was a valid piece of tradecraft. As I was spinning up to show some awesomeness in this example, this morning I was like, you know what, I'm ready to show this off. I'll use the exact same command as Dave, right? I'm gonna even just try to download a legitimate PNG file. And I'll be darned, as I was running it this morning, I was getting access denied even though I'm an admin. I was like, what the heck? You could imagine like 80 times doing the same thing over and over. And then I noticed here, Microsoft has already tried to recover with threats found, MP utility abuse, right?
Utility abuse, man. We caught that abuse.
Yeah, so they're seeing their own abuse, but this is a great example. I mean, talk about like cat and mouse. We went from, you see it now taking automatic actions on this box here. But I was bummed.
That's solid, though. I mean, you're talking couple-day turnaround.
Yeah.
On the weekend.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe if we combine some safety mango with some other stuff, maybe that's the right. And I highly doubt this is the last we see of it. I mean, you recall just like the Teams binary, someone found a way to go through SMB. This will be far, far from the last time that we see these attacks. But there's kind of endless of these, and that's part of the reason we wanted to bring it up. So guys, we always are guilty of going hardcore into the offensive tradecraft, which we enjoy, and we don't necessarily dive into some of the layered security, what we might be able to do on some of this case. So I wanted to open up the last, handful of minutes for us to discuss, well, what can we do, right? We saw that, for instance, putting a payload and not allowing you to go to whatever that was, squirrelymango.com or squirrelymango.fun. What was that?
Safety Mango.
Oh, Safety Mango. Sorry, safetymango.fun. Yeah. Obviously looking at domain reputation was a big deal. But you and I both know that we would just go and start hosting this off of, maybe a GitHub page or OneDrive, or any of those other websites that allow you to store. My new favorite command and control, by the way, is Discord. Anything you upload to Discord, for instance, that you allow somebody else to be able to share, that's traversing off Discord CDN. Well, why can't you store your payloads there? So for anybody I know in the MSP community, I really enjoy both Slack and Discord for both of them. Well, that's a perfect place to store your payloads as well, whether they're obfuscated or not. It's a great place to be able to get that reputation. So I think
the same word from Slack.
Slack, it's all about permissions, right? Can somebody, like for instance, I brought up a page, but it's all about, does Slack police their own content distribution network?
Cool, because I'm pretty sure they have a similar like CDN. I just didn't know if this would, you can get the URL to it. Can anybody hit it? But I guess if you post it in your own Slack, other people shouldn't have permission to view it. But I don't know.
It's interesting to see like one of the Slack where anybody can join.
Yeah.
See what
Public
happens.
Slack.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking to see, I'm failing on my meme game here, but one of the top things I read last week was somebody went and argued that, what, you mean Discord's used for anything else other than command and control? And this is not something new, by the way. It's something, if we take a look, I just screen shared on the fly, right? Even back in November, you see folks saying, hey, malware developers are using Discord's chat service. Some people hosting as their command and control servers to be able to spread malware and harvest stolen data. So there's wild stuff out there. Obviously, be careful. But what we're going is, that doesn't mean stop trying to protect against domains. You should actively scrutinize and look at your content. Albeit, I don't know many partners that actually have the time to do full packet capture. Even if you can't do full packet capture, looking at those command and control URLs is something that you could get a lot of really cool bang for your buck. For instance, I'm going to screen share once more here. From that article earlier of Matt Green, one of the things that he called out was, look, there's a lot of these different download cradles in different places where you might see these websites being used. But notice of his research, he said, look, invoke request is going to give a user agent that looks like this, right? Some of the COM is going to say actual Microsoft Office. So for instance, if you don't have legitimate Microsoft, maybe scriptlets or Microsoft Office macros that allow you to be able to reach out on behalf of Microsoft Office, these are some of those. If you are having any sort of, packet filtering, maybe your firewall allows you to do it, or you've got something like a proxy that's out there. These are some of the things that you can actively look for. So I'll make sure I'll share these in there. But notice it's given all this heads up. With that said, John, I want to share real quick. We see Mozilla, and we see the actual what PowerShell looks like here. Do you mind doing me a real quick favor, John, of bringing up that other malware sample that you screen shared earlier? The one thing I didn't call out when you had it live, but you actually showed what it looked like when it was fetching from that Google Doc web page. Can you bring up that screenshot for me?
Yep. Bring it up now.
So for those that didn't notice, and the reason I'm asking John to bring this up is, for instance, hackers are aware that some defenders are kicking their butts by looking for user agent strings. So notice right above John's red box here, you see the hackers that are actually setting a new user agent string. They're setting it to Mozilla 4.0, info path, something that blends in with a legitimate user agent string instead of those ones earlier that look maybe like Microsoft Office, or call out that it's PowerShell, or call out that it's Python. So there is big bang for the buck, and you can always tell what's actually working against hackers when you take a look at what they're trying to thwart. So yeah, some hackers will actually come together and, like this one here, they used a custom user agent string to get around you. But there's going to be some low-hanging script kiddies out there that are going to use this to attack your SMB clients. And this is something that can give you major bang for the buck if you have access to network telemetry. With that said, Chris, you and I both know that network telemetry is not the end-all be-all. So you want to talk about maybe some of the stuff you could do on the endpoints, whether it's preventing applications from running or those examples?
Yeah. So, Huntress does a lot of this. We are looking at persistence mechanisms and things like that, looking for attacker footholds. And the reason that we identify a lot of these things where a lot of like other next-gen AV and stuff like that fails is because it kind of goes back to what you talked about before. They're looking for the behavior and they're trying to say, is this a legitimate executable? Is this doing something that's expected? Whereas we're looking at it and saying, like, does this even make sense? So when we see persistence mechanisms with these bits of PowerShell that have download string in them with like weird casing and invoke expression and hitting these crazy URLs, and we see HTA files being persisted and all that other kind of stuff. We don't actually have to dig into is this legit or not from an automated means. We flag it as like, hey, this looks bad. Analyst takes a look at it. It takes 30 seconds maybe for a human to look at it and say, nah, that's shady. I don't know what this safetymango.fun is, but I don't think that's legit. And then we mark it as malicious. We can move on. Like, that's the kind of stuff that you can do on the endpoint. We see a lot of this stuff like John showed in batch scripts, bash scripts. If you're on like Linux, we see that kind of stuff. People trying to add more layers of indirection instead of having it in the URL, actually like in the persistence mechanism. They call CMD and then they run a batch script and then that does something else. So you can find it on the endpoint in those ways. You could find it on the endpoint by, I guess technically you could do a DNS cache dumps periodically, try to see what kind of URLs are in the cache. Like look for any weird ones like safetymango.fun, just throwing that out there. Any kind of stuff like that.
For those also haven't seen, right, just because PowerShell is used for bad doesn't mean you can't use it for good. I just plugged a URL for cyberdrain.com, a whole bunch of ways, whether you have like RMM or built-in group policies on how to be able to use PowerShell. Super neat resource on that side of the house. With that said, guys, we're at 2 minutes left, and I know we've had a handful of different questions asked. We always end up with the where is Huntress going to be? Where can I see you? Where's some of the team? What are you doing? Guys, with our last couple of minutes, you want to hit just a real quick call to action. If anybody wants to stay longer, we could, answer those questions.
Yeah. So sneak peek for all the Tradecraft Tuesday fans. You are the first to know about this. The website is live, but the emails have not gone out. We're going to be hosting an event in October on the 13th and 14th called Hackett 2020. If you're interested in that, go and check out hackettmsp.com. Those emails I think are going to go out probably tomorrow or Thursday. So everybody here gets the early heads up. We're also going to be at something called Auvik Tackle 2020. That's happening later this month on the 16th. And so we're going to be there. I think we have a panel there. And GlueX is happening at the end of this month. So if you're interested in that, that's gluex.co.
Cool. Just a reminder for those about the Hackett MSP. It's effectively a 2-day event, but 1 day of content. The idea behind it is we realize not everybody gets to watch these shows during their work hour, or sometimes it's after hours. So we're going to have 2 days, one meant for after hours. The first one's going to be during work hours. So 2 opportunities to catch the same content. With that said, take a look at it. It's out there.
Tradecraft Tuesday is going to be on the 1 day, right?
Yeah.
On the first day on October 13th. Yeah, so Tradecraft Tuesday will be part of Hackett.
Cool. So guys, I know I've got a handful of questions. What's funny is some of these questions that came up even early at the top of the hour, Thomas Freeman asked and said, hey, I've been using clickjacking for phishing testing for a while, very easily stopped in the security headers. So that was one of those comments earlier when we were talking about the ability to do overlays. Obviously on the downloaders doesn't necessarily come up, but you'd be surprised on some of these websites like, where you see the same type of trickery that works, hey, I'm going to make an overlay here. They'll oftentimes borrow not just the impression of the URL, or what you walk away from it, meaning you feel like, oh, I'm confident I was at the right website. It looked like the right website, but you got to understand under the hood there on some of these downloaders, they might be using that same capability to, like, for instance, fetch off one website that then redirects to another website, as we've seen in the past with open redirectors. So huge thanks, Thomas, for being able to point that out and ask some of those questions. Anything else, guys? I mean, it looks like I think we've answered most of them live during the process here. Some of the people asked, hey, have you guys stopped uploading these to YouTube? No, YouTube keeps banning our our actual videos for malicious content. So we're probably going to have to find like a Vimeo website to start storing these, because I think we're now on strike 2 and we've got 1 strike in debate right now. So if they close down our YouTube, obviously we're going to have to move to a different platform, but we're working it there.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's it. I hope downloaders, downloaders, droppers, and essentially loaders and all that fun stuff. Stagers was a useful, hour of your day today. We're stoked to have you here on Tradecraft Tuesday. We'll obviously be back next month. Keep hitting us up with what you're looking to talk about. And huge thanks, everyone, for the content ideas, because this was one of those that was from you. And part of the reason we forgot to cover MITRE ATT&CK today. So huge thanks for that.
Yep. Cool. All right. Take care of yourselves.
All right. Have a good one.
See ya.